It was the kind of summer afternoon that felt like a dream: clear skies, golden sunlight reflecting off the surface of the pool, the distant sound of kids laughing and splashing in the water. Emily had been waiting for this all week. Between the stress of work and the never-ending drama of the HOA, she needed this escape. The pool was her sanctuary, the one place where she could let go of everything, stretch her muscles, and feel weightless. Swimming wasn't just a hobby, it was a part of her physical therapy, something she relied on after the accident that had changed her life forever. She had fought hard to regain her independence, and she wasn't about to let anyone take that away from her, not today. She adjusted her sunglasses and walked confidently toward the lounge chairs, her black bikini fitting perfectly against her sun-kissed skin. It wasn't flashy, just sleek and simple, but it made her feel bold and unapologetically herself. As she laid her towel down and stretched, she let the warmth seep into her muscles, savoring the quiet moment before dipping her toes into the cool water. A sigh of relief escaped her lips. This was exactly what she needed. But peace never lasted long in this neighborhood. Not with Karen around. Emily spotted her immediately, sitting under a giant sun hat, oversized sunglasses perched on her nose, dressed in one of her signature pastel tracksuits. Karen wasn't just any HOA board member, she was the self-appointed enforcer, the kind of woman who thrived on rules, complaints, and making other people miserable. She had made it her personal mission to keep the neighborhood in order, patrolling the streets as if she were some kind of suburban dictator. Emily had dealt with her nonsense before: the snide comments about her disability, the passive-aggressive remarks about her designated parking spot, the way Karen always seemed to have a reason to remind her of the rules. Emily had learned to ignore her. Karen was just one of those people who couldn't stand seeing others happy. Still, she never expected today to turn into a full-blown disaster. At first, Karen seemed to be minding her own business, scrolling on her phone as she sipped from an iced coffee. But Emily knew better. The moment she walked past her toward the pool, she felt Karen's eyes on her, scanning her up and down, looking for something, anything, to complain about. Emily brushed it off, stepping into the pool with a slow, deliberate ease, letting herself drift under the water, weightless, free. For a few minutes, it was just her and the water, the rhythmic strokes, the quiet hum of summer. Then, she surfaced, and Karen was standing at the edge of the pool, watching her like a hawk. Emily sighed, wiping the water from her face. Here we go. Emily could feel the weight of Karen's stare before she even turned around. She adjusted her goggles and looked up, finding Karen standing just a few feet away, arms crossed, her lips pursed into a tight line. The telltale sign that she was about to start something. Emily sighed and treaded water, forcing herself to remain calm. She wasn't going to let Karen ruin her day. "Excuse me," Karen said, her voice dripping with forced politeness. "Are you sure this is the best place for you to be?" Emily blinked, tilting her head. "What?" Karen let out a theatrical sigh, stepping closer to the water's edge as if she were about to deliver some grand decree. "With your condition, pools can be dangerous. I'm only thinking about your safety." Emily bit back the immediate urge to roll her eyes. "I swim here all the time, Karen. I'm fine." Karen's expression didn't change, but her fingers curled around the phone in her hand, nails tapping against the case. "Well, it's just that we have rules," she continued, her voice taking on that familiar patronizing tone. "And this is a family-friendly environment. Some people might find certain attire inappropriate." Emily glanced down at her bikini and then back at Karen, unimpressed. "This? It's a swimsuit, Karen. At a pool." Karen's lips pressed even tighter together, almost disappearing into her face. "I'm not saying I have a problem with it, but others might." Emily let out a sharp laugh, shaking her head. "Let me guess. Those others are just you." A faint flush of pink rose in Karen's cheeks, but before she could respond, Emily turned and dove back into the water. She let herself sink deeper, welcoming the cool silence. Karen wasn't worth her time. For a while, she simply swam, slow and steady, letting her body move through the water in perfect rhythm. For the first time all week, she felt free, unbothered, weightless. But that peace didn't last long. When she surfaced, Karen was still there. But now, she wasn't just watching, she was on her phone, typing furiously, her lips curled into a smug little smile. Emily exhaled sharply, shaking her head as she pulled herself out of the pool and grabbed her towel. Whatever drama Karen was cooking up, she'd deal with it later. She wasn't going to let the woman dictate her day. 15 minutes later, the sound of sirens pierced the air. Emily sat up, heart sinking. No way. She couldn't be serious. Sure enough, 2 uniformed police officers walked through the pool gate, their expressions a mix of confusion and concern. Behind them, Karen followed closely, chin lifted high, radiating self-righteous satisfaction. There she is, Karen announced, pointing at Emily like she had just caught a criminal mastermind. She's not supposed to be here. She's endangering herself and others. Emily blinked, utterly dumbfounded. Are you serious? The taller of the 2 officers held up a hand. Ma'am, we received a report about a possible trespasser and a safety concern. Mind explaining what's going on? Emily stood, gripping the towel tightly around her shoulders. I live here. I'm a resident. I'm not trespassing, and I'm definitely not a safety hazard. Karen let out a dramatic huff, shaking her head. She's not telling the whole story. She's been acting suspiciously and refusing to follow community guidelines. I had no choice but to call. The second officer, who had been quietly observing, glanced between the 2 women, clearly trying to piece together what the actual emergency was. Do you have proof of residency? Of course, Emily said, moving to grab her bag from the lounge chair. She pulled out her key fob and her driver's license, handing them over. Here's my access card and my ID. My address matches the community. The taller officer inspected them, nodding after a few moments. Everything checks out. Emily turned back to Karen, arms crossed. Care to explain why you just wasted everyone's time? Karen's confidence wavered for a moment, but she quickly recovered, forcing an indignant scoff. I was just doing my duty as a responsible community member. We can't be too careful these days. The officer sighed, rubbing his temple. Ma'am, there's no crime being committed here. If you were concerned, you should have spoken with the HOA, not called 911. Emily let out a dry laugh. She's been harassing me since I moved in. This isn't about safety, it's about control. The second officer, still watching Karen closely, nodded. We'll make a note of this incident. Ma'am, false reports are a serious matter. Don't do it again. Karen's smug expression cracked. But. No buts, the officer cut in firmly. This isn't an emergency. This isn't even an issue. Don't waste police resources like this. As the officers turned to leave, Karen stood frozen, her face shifting from satisfaction to something closer to panic. She had expected to be praised for her vigilance, not reprimanded for it. Emily just smiled, shaking her head. Better luck next time, Karen. She grabbed her towel and strolled back to her lounge chair, stretching out under the sun. The pool might be in an HOA-controlled community, but for today, it was hers. Emily let out a breath, stretching her arms over her head as the officers walked away. The sun was warm against her skin, the pool water still glistening under the afternoon light, and for a brief moment, she thought maybe, just maybe, Karen would back down after being publicly humiliated. But deep down, she knew better. Karen didn't take losses well. She wasn't the type to slink away after being reprimanded. No, Karen would stew in her embarrassment, twisting the situation in her mind until she found a way to make herself the victim. Emily didn't have to wait long to find out what was coming next. The next morning, an email landed in her inbox from the HOA board. The subject line made her stomach twist: "Incident at community pool, investigation pending." Frowning, she opened it, skimming the message. It was a formal notice informing her that the HOA had received a complaint about a reckless pool incident involving a minor. According to the email, an unnamed resident had reported that a young child had been injured due to irresponsible behavior in the water, and until further review, the board would be discussing potential restrictions on her pool access. Emily's blood ran cold. Karen. This had Karen's fingerprints all over it. She set her coffee down, gripping her phone tightly before calling Jess. The moment her friend answered, Emily launched straight in. "You are not going to believe what Karen pulled this time." By the time she finished explaining, Jess let out an enraged huff. "That woman is out of her damn mind. We were there the whole time. There wasn't a single kid near you." Emily nodded, already pulling on her sneakers. "I'm not sitting around and waiting for them to review this garbage complaint. I'm going straight to the HOA office." When she arrived, Mr. Reynolds, the HOA president, was already reviewing the complaint. His expression was tight with frustration when he looked up at her. "I was expecting you," he said. "I figured you'd want to respond to this." Emily scoffed, crossing her arms. "Respond to what? A complete lie?" He exhaled through his nose, rubbing his temple. "Look, I'm not saying I believe it. But HOA policy requires us to investigate any report we receive, and unfortunately, we've already had 2 other residents back up Karen's claim." Emily stiffened. Karen had recruited people to lie for her. Her frustration only grew as she glanced at the report in Mr. Reynolds' hands. The so-called incident was vague, filled with general statements about reckless swimming and concern for the safety of children. There were no specific names, no actual injuries listed. Just enough to stir up trouble. Before she could argue, the office door opened, and a voice cut through the tension. "This is ridiculous." Emily turned to see Mrs. Holloway, a longtime resident and mother of 3, standing in the doorway. She looked furious, her eyes locking onto Mr. Reynolds. "I was at the pool yesterday. My kids were there the whole time, and I can tell you right now, this is a lie." Mr. Reynolds looked taken aback. "Mrs. Holloway. I've put up with Karen's nonsense for years," she snapped. "She's reported my kids for playing with chalk on the sidewalk. She called security on my husband for grilling in our backyard. And now she's trying to ban Emily from the pool? No. I'm not letting her get away with this." Another voice joined in. "Neither am I." Emily turned again, startled to see Mark, another longtime resident, stepping forward. He had his arms crossed, his jaw tight with frustration. "Karen tried to report me last year because my recycling bin was out too early. She's been harassing all of us for years. Enough is enough." Something in the air shifted. Mr. Reynolds looked between them, his frown deepening. He had been dealing with Karen's complaints for years, but it was clear this was the moment everything was coming to a head. As if on cue, more neighbors started stepping forward. "She called the HOA on my daughter's lemonade stand. She tried to fine me for having a bird feeder in my yard. She reported my dog for barking, and he's a senior rescue who barely makes a sound." The office was filling with voices, each one louder than the last, and Emily couldn't help but feel a sense of relief. It wasn't just her. She wasn't alone in this. Karen had made an enemy out of nearly everyone in the community, and now they were finally ready to push back. Mr. Reynolds held up a hand, silencing the growing crowd. He turned back to Emily, his eyes sharp with realization. "It's clear to me that this complaint was filed in bad faith," he said. And that Karen has been using the HOA as a personal weapon against residents for far too long. Emily could see the finality in his expression, the way he was already shifting gears. Karen had finally overplayed her hand. Mr. Reynolds stood, setting the report aside. "We're calling an emergency HOA meeting," he announced to the gathered neighbors. "Karen's actions will be addressed publicly. And this time, she won't be able to hide behind false complaints." Emily exhaled slowly, a satisfied smile tugging at her lips. For the first time since she moved into the neighborhood, she felt like justice was finally on the horizon. Emily had barely stepped out of the HOA office before her phone buzzed with a notification. Then another. And another. A sinking feeling settled in her stomach as she unlocked her screen and saw the flood of messages in the neighborhood Facebook group. The top post, written in all caps and exclamation points, made her stomach turn. "Beware, troublemaker in our community." Karen had wasted no time launching her next attack. Emily tapped the post, reading through the mess of accusations Karen had thrown together. According to her, Emily was not just a reckless swimmer, she was a serial troublemaker who had been disrespecting HOA rules, arguing with neighbors, and endangering the safety of the community. The post painted her as a rude, entitled resident who had no regard for order, someone who thought the rules didn't apply to her. It was absurd. It was a lie. And worst of all, it was working. Emily scrolled through the comments, seeing a mix of reactions. Some people immediately sided with Karen, posting things like, "I knew something was off about her," and, "We need to keep our community safe from people like this." Others were skeptical, asking for details, but the damage was already done. Karen had planted the seed, and now people who didn't even know Emily personally were treating her like a neighborhood menace. Her chest tightened as she saw names she recognized, neighbors who used to smile at her, people she had made small talk with, hesitating, questioning, buying into Karen's nonsense. Then, another comment popped up. "Jess, this is absolute garbage. Y'all really gonna believe Karen after all the nonsense she's pulled? Let's talk about how she called the cops on a man for trimming his hedges too early in the morning, or how she tried to get the HOA to fine a woman for having a wreath on her door that wasn't seasonally appropriate." Emily let out a breath, relief washing over her. Jess wasn't letting this slide. More comments started rolling in, people bringing up Karen's long history of complaints, her power-hungry tendencies, her obsession with controlling the neighborhood. Some residents who had been on the fence suddenly started shifting, realizing they had seen this pattern before. But Karen wasn't done. Hours later, Emily received an email directly from the HOA, informing her that multiple new complaints had been filed against her, all for petty, ridiculous infractions. One was about her trash cans being placed too close to the curb. Another claimed her mailbox color was too bright and distracting. One even alleged that she had been playing loud music at night, something that had never happened. It was clear what was happening. Karen was enlisting her cronies to bury Emily in HOA violations, to make it seem like she was an ongoing problem. Emily clenched her jaw. Enough. She didn't waste time, she drove straight to Jess's house, and together, they started gathering proof. Jess pulled up security camera footage from the night Emily was accused of playing loud music, showing absolute silence. Mrs. Holloway provided pictures showing Emily's trash cans were placed exactly where they were supposed to be. Mark, who had lived in the neighborhood for years, found an old HOA bulletin that confirmed Emily's mailbox color had already been approved years ago. They had the evidence. Now, all they needed was for the HOA to listen. When the emergency HOA meeting finally convened, the room was packed. Word had spread fast. People weren't just there for Emily, they were there for themselves, for every ridiculous complaint, every petty rule enforcement Karen had ever thrown their way. Karen sat at the front, arms crossed, lips twisted into a smug smile, convinced she was winning. But the moment Mr. Reynolds stepped forward, her expression flickered. He didn't look like a man who was about to side with her. Over the past 24 hours, he began, his voice calm but firm, our office has received multiple complaints regarding a single resident, Emily. However, upon closer inspection, we've found that many of these complaints have been fabricated or exaggerated. Karen's head snapped up, eyes narrowing. Excuse me? Mr. Reynolds didn't even look at her. He continued. We've reviewed the alleged infractions. Video evidence contradicts the noise complaint. Photographs disprove the trash can violation. Documentation confirms the mailbox color was pre-approved. This leads us to a bigger issue, one that has been brought to my attention by multiple residents. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle over the room. The misuse of HOA authority to target and harass community members. The room erupted into murmurs. Karen sat up straighter, the smugness gone. This is outrageous. I was only enforcing the rules. Were you? Mr. Reynolds turned toward her, eyebrow raised. Because based on the overwhelming complaints we've received about your conduct, it appears that you are the problem, Karen. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Jess nudged Emily, whispering, "Oh, this is gonna be good." Mr. Reynolds continued, his voice sharpening. There is a difference between maintaining order and abusing power. And based on the number of testimonies we have, it's become clear that your actions have crossed the line. Effective immediately, you are no longer permitted to enforce HOA rules in any capacity. Karen's mouth fell open. You can't do that. Oh, I can, Mr. Reynolds said simply. And I just did. The tension in the room snapped, replaced by a wave of satisfaction. People were nodding, whispering, a few even applauding. They had all suffered under Karen's rule, and now, finally, she was being held accountable. Karen looked around, searching for support, but found none. The people she thought would back her up were either silent or looking away, unwilling to stick their necks out for her. For the first time, she looked small. Emily folded her arms, watching as Karen swallowed hard, her face flushed red with humiliation. Meeting adjourned, Mr. Reynolds said, slamming the gavel down. It was over. Finally, after everything, it was over. The room emptied out slowly, the murmurs of neighbors lingering like the final echoes of a long-awaited storm passing through. Karen sat motionless, her face drained of color, staring at the spot where Mr. Reynolds had stood moments before, as if willing time to rewind. But there was no undoing what had just happened. The power she had clung to so desperately, the authority she had wielded like a weapon for years, was gone. Emily didn't bother hiding her smirk as she and Jess made their way toward the door, passing Karen on the way out. For once, Karen had no snide remarks, no passive-aggressive quips, no condescending smiles. Just silence. Outside, neighbors were chatting in hushed but excited voices. Mark clapped Emily on the back, grinning. I think we just witnessed history. Jess laughed. I don't know what was better, Mr. Reynolds shutting her down or watching her realize she had absolutely no allies left. Emily exhaled, feeling the tension of the past few days finally ease. Either way, I don't think we'll have to worry about her patrolling the pool anymore. Karen eventually shuffled out of the HOA building, keeping her head down as she passed the small groups of neighbors still lingering. If she had expected sympathy, she found none. People stepped aside as she walked by, some whispering, others openly shaking their heads. A slow, sarcastic clap started near the back of the crowd, followed by laughter. Karen stiffened but didn't look back. She got into her car, gripping the steering wheel with white-knuckled fingers before speeding off into the night. The next morning, the entire neighborhood was still buzzing. By the time Emily checked her phone, the HOA ruling was all over the community Facebook group. A thread titled, "Finally Free from Queen Karen," had over 100 comments, filled with neighbors celebrating the end of her reign. Someone had even edited a picture of Karen with a comically large band stamp across it. Emily scrolled through the posts, laughing at some of the stories being shared, tales of fines over garden decorations, complaints about unauthorized Christmas lights, and even an attempt to enforce a "no laughing too loudly" rule at the playground. It was ridiculous. But now, finally, it was over. As she sat by the pool later that day, soaking in the sun without Karen's watchful glare, she couldn't help but wonder, why did people like her always think they could control everything? Was it about power, insecurity, or just pure entitlement? What do you think? Have you ever felt powerless against HOA rules or a Karen in your community? Share your experiences below. Let's see who had it worse.